is this inappropriate relationship with technology. And I say inappropriate relationship because it's two sides. It's the way we design technology. And I was having a conversation with a few senators just briefly before this interview, where I was sharing with them an anecdote about a meeting I had with a few major scientists and a few major technologists together in one room. Mind you, we all speak different languages because designers, we speak yet another language. And at one point, the technologists were describing user experience. And it took about 5 minutes to read the scientists in the room and realize they thought we were talking about drug addiction.
Very excited today to have Ari Peralta on our podcast. Ari, you're a Harvard-trained neuroscientist and an award-winning sensory designer, also founder of Origami. And we met you, Ari, back in May at the Global One Estate Real Estate and Community Symposium, where you were giving a presentation on spatial design. And we were so fascinated with what you were presenting, especially in context of design, architecture, and wellness, that I was saying, like, I got to run out, catch this guy, grab him, and see if he wants to come on our podcast. And you said yes. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we want to see if you can maybe give us a bit of background. What got you into neuroscience, spatial design? What's your formal background, and what's kind of your personal road that drove you to that direction?
Well, I want to start by saying that I'm a designer first and then a scientist. And so I'll speak from a design language that most of us probably listening to this podcast can connect with. You know, we're curious people as designers, and we're really trying to find new ways to connect people with space and connect space with people. And whether it's technology, whether it's art, whether it's the senses in my case, we're all trying to figure out how to create environments that are as dynamic and transformative as we are as humans. And that innate curiosity, in one way or another, led me to neuroscience. I started working with neuroscientists, hiring neuroscientists, big names from Oxford University, like Dr. Charles Spence, a good friend now, and really applying that into my design projects. As I evolved as a designer, I was evolving from working with brands for activations and multisensory experiences, and noticed, we can have significant more impact through design than what I imagined. And the more I meet with neuroscientists, the more I'm left curious with more questions, and also with this interest in being able to dominate that language so I could speak to them in their language and translate whatever I could back to our design field. So it was that innate curiosity for how the brain perceives environments, how the brain appreciates environments, and then what happens inside our bodies if that is good or bad. And that's really what led my interest in understanding multimodal experiences, so more than one sensory modality, which in the end, no surprise, it's as a human, it's how we experience life. Any moment is multisensory. So starting to expand the language in design, to see sensory design more than a niche sensory category that you just kind of check off on, and understanding it as a whole, right? How do we perceive environments and becomes one idea, one meaning, and how do we prevent the fragmentation in design we experience today? So those were my big inspirations and drivers to neuroscience.
It's absolutely fascinating, and I like to watch podcasts and videos of other neuroscientists. There's others that are more sort of mainstream, like Dr. Andrew Huberman, and he's talking about wellness and well-being from a different angle. But you seem to have now shifted your focus from sort of design and neuroscience now into the wellness and well-being space. What led you down that journey?
A combination of an experience that we're all living through, which is overstimulation, and just being always on the go, finding that time and our sense of time was changing. And in addition to that, I did go through cancer which now I'm a survivor and grateful now almost 6 years through. But that experience allowed me to understand the most precious things about life at an early age. I'm about to be 40, so it happened at an early age for me. And to experience this in one of the best designed um, cancer clinics in the country led me to say, wait a minute, what are we designing? This has metal, and I'm feeling the metal in my body, and it does not feel good. Right now, I'm going through chemo, and I don't really talk about this era because it's a painful time, but it's really what gave the birth to this passion. Why aren't we adding chromotherapy into these spaces? Why don't we have dynamic soundscapes so our ears are sensitive? How can we make them more adaptive and modular for making the experience of healing truly healing?
Well, I mean,
Beyond
that's a very personal experience and motivation to explore that deeper. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's amazing.
So you just mentioned time there, which is a fascinating subject all on its own. What would be interesting to get your take? We're overstimulated, which I guess a lot of neuroscientists probably played a role into how to keep people engaged and stimulated for the benefit of social media companies, etc. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Now you're trying to find an antidote to that, probably using the same tools that they did in order to overstimulate us in the first place.
Well, I think that I say this to a lot of my clients. I fall in love with the problem much more than the solution, which is why I solve problems. And I think that without demeaning neuroscience in the past, I have no issue saying I was part of that, right? I was applying neuroscience. I wasn't a neuroscientist yet at that point, but I was applying neuroscience through our partnerships to create experiences and brand engagements that were more engaging. The issue was, as I started really learning more about the brain in a formal way, and really not through the lens of marketing, I started understanding and realizing there's kind of categories of people, biologically speaking, in terms of their sensory perception, their thresholds, the amount of information they can receive and the amount of information they can process. This changed everything for me. This is what led me down that rabbit hole that I have not left yet. Can I, together with our team, profile sensory preferences? Is there a way we can predict sensory triggers? And most importantly, back to the point of overstimulation and sensory overload, is there a way we can help people decompress from this overstimulation? Is there a way we can enable and empower people to self-regulate? And this is why I fell in love with the senses. I had used the senses to keep you engaged in an experience. And now I realize we could use the senses to reduce pain, to distract the brain when it is in a certain type of negative thinking. And we started applying this to impact and, I would say, health and healing forward projects. Beyond wellness, my concern with wellness, as you both know, since I mentioned this, the global wellness real estate, listen, it's doing great as an industry. 5.4, I think 5.7, now $6 trillion. That's great. Unfortunately, the number of people healing doesn't match that. In fact, it keeps shrinking. This is the opportunity I think we have to reposition wellness to well-being, which is a human outcome, something that we can measure, and most importantly, as humans, we can feel. And yes, I think that was a great motivator to want to be part of that change. And since then, it's really been about, one, understanding our biological differences and how to create experiences that can adapt to those different types of preferences. Today, we speak of it through the lens of neurodiversity, and we call only a section or slice of the population as neurodiverse. But what I've discovered is we're all neurodiverse to a different degree, and sometimes with a different sensitivity with a sense. Some of us are more sensitive to sound than others. Others are more to touch. Others, their whole system is compromised, right? So it's different. But if we could understand that, designers and architects would have a tool to create a space that can be multiple things to multiple people.
Yeah, that would be an amazing outcome. When you're doing the research, have you found anything that there's either age-related, gender-related, stress-related? Is there anything that you found as a common denominator that points to being able to pinpoint that it's a certain thing that applies to more people than just a small group? Is there anything specific?
I have found some common denominators, and I say this respectfully to the technology companies we have today, but one of the biggest common denominators we've identified is this inappropriate relationship with technology. And I say inappropriate relationship because it's two sides. It's the way we design technology. And I was having a conversation with a few senators just briefly before this interview, where I was sharing with them an anecdote about a meeting I had with a few major scientists and a few major technologists together in one room. Mind you, we all speak different languages because designers, we speak yet another language. And at one point, the technologists were describing user experience. And it took about 5 minutes to read the scientists in the room and realize they thought we were talking about drug addiction. And I want you to think about that, right? We use the same word for human experience in technology as we do for a human experiencing addiction. And I think that says it all. But for those who still need further expansion and explanation on that, I think this is where we identified our relationship again that we have with the technology. First of all, we're creating technology in a way that is exploitative of our brain, exploitative of our primitive brain, because it's a primitive brain. And what do I mean by primitive? Because we think we're advanced. Well, the same systems in which we perceive humans, love, and things that are important like family, that's how we perceive buildings too. It's using the same system. It's also how we perceive technologies. On top of that, then we've added apps, social media, and other algorithmic, exploitative algorithmic interventions into these technologies that already are there to exploit our brain. And we haven't really learned how to deal with all that. And, I hear a lot about dopamine detox, dopamine being a neurotransmitter in the brain that we mostly know is responsible for the regulation of pleasure, the regulation of reward system. And while a lot of people are talking about dopamine detox, we can't just have the brain stop making dopamine. Dopamine is very important for digestion, for sleep, for other things as well. But what's happening is our threshold is changing. And if our threshold for rewards keeps getting lower and lower, that means we need more and more stimulation to get just a little bit of reward. So what we've missed, or what we are missing in technology and in the way we're designing spaces or products or anything, is how do we remind our customers, our guests, and even ourselves that the long-term reward is equally as good in our brain as the short-term return. And I'm not speaking just psychologically, I'm speaking now biologically. Our brain feels just as good when we can regulate those two. Right now, because the threshold for what I call microwave experiences, right? Quick, get it, feel, quick, get it, feel, repeat. We're running into a pattern. And the algorithms aren't just in our phones or computers, they're in our brain. We are algorithms in a way as well. So it's about now how to use these things in a responsible way. And in the future of design, I see less screens, I see less notifications, and I see more control on our part when we want to have displays all around us and when we don't.
So that would be a good segue to start to understand how you start seeing that, because clearly technology is not going away and is going to be an important part of the rest of our lives, but it's how to use it to our advantage. And I assume there must be some learning that you're able to do to see how we are responding to technology, to think, oh, okay, how can we leverage that for our own benefit and our own health and ultimate well-being?
And that's where the conversation's evolving to, right? The conversation in marketing and branding, that's been going on for quite a while, and they've been quite successful. Look at the mess we've created, right? But I think now the idea is, how do we work with traditional doctors, with functional doctors, with Eastern medicine, Western medicine, with all of it, just like the senses, with all of it, and see how we connect it all. And I think I speak for probably 99.9% of designers out there. We're not really on a quest to hurt anyone with the design we're setting out to do. It's quite the opposite. We want to make people feel good in the spaces, products, or experiences we design. That said, we need more tools to get it better, to get it right. And today, most experiences, even the ones I promote through multisensory, people think it's just about more, and it's not. It's about this concept called congruency. And when I mean congruency, it's much more than context. It's a difficult word to describe, but when we add different components in nature that go well together, it gives us something greater than the sum of its parts. And that's how emotions happen. That's how sensory memory occurs. And when it comes to design for wellness, it's about also understanding that wellness is an industry, and well-being, the outcome, may be defined differently by each person. So now we don't just have a variable with the design aesthetic preference or perception, but we also have a new variable. Where are you in your wellness journey? Where are you in your journey of being the best version of yourself? Does that happen through weekly massages, monthly facials? I'm not sure. I'm not here to answer that one. But I can tell you that where I've seen a possibility of all this connecting is in one thing: our emotional intelligence, our ability to not be a victim of our own emotions. We think of emotions as this package we control. Most of us know it's difficult to control our emotions in that moment. And that's the part that design has a crucial role. And I think now we have a social role to fulfill. How do we create spaces, environments, experiences, and products that enable us to go beyond that moment when we're stuck?
Amazing.
Oh, I'm just like,
I know there's so many questions.
script out of the window.
Yeah. So maybe we could break that down a little bit. When you talk about environments, I assume we're thinking about, there may be certain building typographies that we can create that are places of community that people can come to and socialize and network. And then I guess we can get down to the minutiae of elements within those spaces, whether it's lighting, acoustics, color, et cetera, et cetera. So could you explain sort of big to small what you mean by some of that?
So on the macro scale, it's difficult to describe the multitude of preferences that we have for shape, form. That said, there are these set of principles that are over 100 years old, developed in Germany from the psychological lens, called the Gestalt Principles. And this is applied quite a lot in design, whether it's in architecture and interior design in particular, from symmetry to order. It really helps us explain the sequence of events of how we perceive something to be beautiful. I was curious to see if, and it only focuses on the visual aspect, I was curious to see if we could translate that across the other senses. And we started doing that with a team of scientists and researchers that joined me. And it was very interesting because, again, going back to our primitive brain, we perceive everything almost as a person, right? As a human. even if it doesn't have human shape. That's why when we see robots that look like us, we feel a little bit more than robots that don't look at us. And make them small and look like a baby, you're even more engaged. This principle of embodied cognition is the best way I can describe on a macro scale our relationship with buildings, with environments and spaces. We see hugs, we see faces. When I've worked in automotive, we see eyes and smiles and all kinds of things. And you're going to see that much more prominent in automotive, in product brands, and in branding. But we don't really speak about that in architecture and interiors. And sometimes we translate emotions like, oh yeah, that couch has a fabric that just gives you a hug. Well, we use it in our lexicon, but we're not applying it. So the first and larger view of how neuroscience and neuroaesthetics is helping advance the field of architecture and design is helping understand that as a base, we perceive objects mostly as people. We use the same neural systems and circuits to evaluate and perceive that. And we give it human qualities. So if I like something, it's warmer, it's more inviting, it's kind. And if I don't, it's hard, it's edgy, it's forbidden. Now, we have a relationship with angles based on our evolutionary biology. And this is explained mostly because of our optical nerve. While there are differences in gender, and while there are differences as we age, optical nerve range can change. From what we understand today, the male gender has a much more narrow optical nerve, which we associate psychologically with much more focus, with the ability to kind of cancel out peripheral to really get to that target and get that hunt. And what we've seen with the female gender is that that angle is a little bit wider. Almost, again, this is all now theoretical, because I think some of these things will evolve as we better understand. But they're able to sense much more of their environment, almost in a protection kind of mode, if you will, and being able to differentiate not just shapes from, and sometimes within distance. Now, not talking about any kind of ocular degeneration or anything or any condition like that, but I think now maybe around 15% of women can see up to 3 times more colors than men. We're the ones that are mostly colorblind compared to women. So you can see that there are these evolutionary hints that are still there in this primitive setting we're in. And now going into the much more finite scale within spaces. So if we look at the big side, there's embodied cognition. We perceive buildings, spaces, products, environments, almost as we do people, and assign those values to them. Inside spaces, what we've learned in particular with our research with Kimball International, one of the largest furniture manufacturers in North America, healthcare, workplace, hospitality, higher education, we actually did a study with thousands of participants in each one of these settings. And we realized that the setting didn't matter. What mattered was the context of what they were doing. So context is king when it comes to interiors. And what we learned was that you can have one space that has micro environments in that space. And today, when we're listening to the concern with the exodus of employees and trying to get the workforce back into workplace, we've learned that the style that perhaps like the Googles and Amazons of the world isn't for everyone, right? Open space isn't for everyone. It depends on the type of work that you do. And that's part of what we identified in this major study with them that is now published. And I encourage your followers and listeners to check it out. But we identified that there's a direct relationship between translating the company culture with their design culture. And after following and understanding what people are doing today based on their workplace and based on their job responsibilities, people just want flexibility and comfort to do the work they want to do or the work they've been hired to do. Lounges are great for marketing, but not if you're in finance. You want a desk and a desktop for that. And brands, I mean, it's sometimes common sense for us, but brands don't really understand that yet. So helping them understand how to create a space that can accommodate different space type needs is what Kimball really did a great job at through our research, identifying not just furniture types and layouts, but even sensory preferences, from privacy to noise, all the way to biophilic elements like plants. Which ones work, which ones don't, and which ones are valued by which culture more.
Yeah, that's a huge aspect as well. That's why we were saying earlier is how much do things apply to a lot of people and how much is it a specific or a smaller group or that background is important. One thing that sprang to my mind, because I'm personally so fascinated about in the wellness room about neuroplasticity and just really understanding how to I keep wondering, how do I rewire my brain? How do I get rid of old beliefs, patterns? So I'm always curious about what we can do in a space to implement in a space that allows for the brain to change, to get relaxed, to be able to want to change and to be in that sort of brainwave. And then for change to happen, especially when we, let's say, go to a wellness resort and we want to change our eating habit or our stress. Is there anything insight that you have on that, how spaces can support that?
So first of all, change is difficult. And for anyone who's trying to change any good or bad habit, it's difficult. Again, we are an algorithm of habits. We label them based on the meaning we give them. Now, what's interesting about neuroplasticity, and for those who don't know, it's describing the brain's ability to be plastic. In other words, the brain's ability to learn and grow or unlearn and shrink. And the brain's dynamic just like we are dynamic. Unfortunately, the perception we have, the lens we have for reality is kind of fixed, so we can't see those changes at the same time. That said, what I do know is that, yes, our brain is always plastic in the sense that we see something, we learn something. Yes, we see those new neural connections or those stronger neural connections. But we also see what happens when you don't put it to practice, especially within the first 30 to 90 days of learning something. If you don't put it to practice, well, the brain's just going to find another area to give that energy to, right? And that's where we see the reverse of neuroplasticity. Now, when it comes to behavioral change and breaking deep patterns, whether those are nutritional patterns, sleep patterns, or like me, charging your phone patterns. I'm horrible at charging my phone. It can be very challenging. And part of what we understand is, or at least the work that I work in, is to help and support you in that journey. You're going to need some sensory soothers to help you when you're triggered. And that's what I focused on, is how do we provide those sensory soothers that are based on your preferences, that work for you, that have meaning for you, that in one way or another allow you to get out of whatever pattern you're trying to break. Now, I want to give you an example of this, because sometimes those can be subconscious. We worked with a wonderful company, alum of the Global Wellness Summit and Institute, Sanctum. I don't know if you're familiar with Sanctum.
Yes, we are very familiar. We've tried it out. We love it.
Wonderful team with Gab and Luke, and now with their partnership and growth with Six Senses, just been wonderful to see them grow. Well, when we worked with them, we were first analyzing the different sensory elements that they wanted to introduce and position, let's say, in their sequence of theatrical fitness and movement. And obviously, they wanted to start with certain elements right from the get-go to kind of just get you in. And while I was all for that, I didn't want to overwhelm the customer, the guest, with scent yet. We played with scent, and if you've done their activities, you'll notice towards a little bit beyond halfway point. At this point, you're tired, your brain's feeling tired, your body's feeling tired, lactic acid's kicking in, and you're feeling it. That's when we introduce scent, right? To distract your brain, empower you, and those microseconds of introducing whatever that scent was. We tried different ones, but then it becomes more a preference which one you like or dislike. This was done in a functional way. So I wanted to introduce you to functional sensory interventions. This is the future also of sound, right? Using functional music in precise moments to help guide the experience. Right now, we've been playing with one of our major partners, testing scent and sound to begin and end a spa session. No clocks, no timers, no notifications, at least not that kind of notification. This is where the future of how to play with these sensory elements for behavioral change start to take place.
Oh, I love that. And I think when you were explaining as well, it's sometimes a good thing. Like we always think, oh, a good scent is a good thing. But if it's done at the wrong time, it's not necessarily a good outcome. And I remember you were saying at your presentation at the Global Wellness Summit as well, for us as designers to think about if we pump everything into the space at once and everything that we think is aesthetically pleasing, it can do the opposite and it can actually harm people in the space. And I thought that was really interesting. So I'm really intrigued to think by myself. I was like, okay, we're thinking about all these great things, but don't put it in either the wrong time or the wrong place or all at once. So that's...
And think about the fact that we're all in sensory overload. So let's just stop and pause for a second and put these things now together into logic, right? We are all overstimulated, and we're going into places that are overstimulating. That produces sensory overload. What happens in the brain when we have sensory overload? I can ask you guys, because I know you've experienced it. You close your eyes, you want to run away from wherever you're at, and you cancel everything until you have some peace and quiet. So what good is all our design efforts when the people that are coming in, they're really overwhelmed. And anything we do, even with the greatest intention and purpose, it may be off-putting. And sensory overload is what most of us are experiencing. When we've done work in retail, it was incredible to see how many people stopped shopping when they felt sensory overload. At that point, you couldn't appreciate how nice the fabric was because you just started getting a headache.
Yeah, I know these experiences.
To that point, we try and be very mindful of our designs, and especially in the wellness space, of not overstimulating. People are going there to decompress or have a transformational experience. So whilst we want to make something look beautiful and appropriate, we're conscious of peeling back the layers and not giving too much. Do you think the industry generally is guilty, in the design industry, of designing for the sake of designing and not taking that so much into consideration?
Going back to the statement I made earlier, I've learned to fall in love with the problem more than the solution I think I can bring. Then I can really solve it. And I think all of us, again, have that great intention, but we're really not understanding the situation overall that's happening. And this is something, when I talk about sensory overload, maybe 10 years ago when I heard and learned about sensory overload, it was something that only a few people really maybe experienced, Wall Street people, etc. Now this is something kids are experiencing, babies are experiencing. That's how much this is affecting us. And again, this is not about, well, technology is going to be the way it's going to be. No, we're designing technology as we go. Let's adjust these things. Nobody has signed up for this. Nobody. So I think that responsible design is very important. But I want to bring something or mention something through the example you just gave. You talked about coming in to the wellness space. One of the biggest issues I see with wellness spaces is coming out. We do a great job, I think, at grounding you, at transforming whatever you came out of and coming into this amazing, tranquil space that we've deliberately designed. But what's the way out like? And I think that's a big challenge that all of us are trying to resolve now.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
What is the solution for that? Because we often,
interconnected wellness is what the solution will be. And as we stop driving cars, they will be now vessels for us to be well. And I think that it's about connecting the different spaces that we inhabit again, to create a seamless experience. And I think what's exciting is that it's hard to explain because it's the future. But I think what's exciting is that designers like us won't just stop at the physical shop, at the brick and mortar. We won't stop there anymore. I know now we're trying to get out to the sidewalk and the garden and all that, but we have to think way beyond that. And I think our design efforts will be seen anywhere and everywhere there is human interaction.
I just want to go back a couple of steps. You talked about some of the principles of design and architecture around the Gestalt theories. Back then, how were they measuring that? I assume it was fairly abstract. They were sort of assuming through, I don't know how, talking to people, versus now, I assume you have ways to measure people's reactions to certain spaces. So technology is playing a part in giving evidence to your theories.
Correct. And this is where the magic of a new type of research started by my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Charles Spence, the cross-modal approach. Again, looking at multiple modalities. Well, how do we measure them simultaneously, and how do we cross-relate? And it's interesting because when I started adding, typically most people in the wellness sphere today are using some variation of heart rate variability, of HRV. That's typically the most common used measurement today. And when we started adding other measurements, whether it was EEG with the brain, or a QEEG with voltage of the brain, or GSR, galvanic skin response, and looking at the electrodermal activity, what we started seeing is that sometimes we could have a positive wellness result in one biomarker and a negative one in the other biomarker. And the question I would have to our team of scientists that I would hire back then, well, why? Which one do we believe? Which one's accurate? And like I've learned now through science, it's another question. It's answered with more questions. So this is where the challenge is now. And I think what's great is that now we're learning to weigh out these different biomarkers. And as we start integrating wearables much more into our daily routine, I think we'll be able to start making much better correlations. Now that we connect genetics with this, we're able to also make better connections. But I think that very similar to what I mentioned with the senses, when it comes to health biomarkers, when you see them all together, sometimes it adds up to something different than if you see just the individual component. So I think that with the evolution of these different technologies, but also with the evolution of more mobile brain measurement technologies, they're getting better. I'm not a big fan yet of mobile EEGs, but we're getting closer to one that we will be proud of. So I think that this is also giving us, paired with eye tracking, which has really, really significantly evolved. When I started working with eye tracking, it was literally just kind of directional. Now we can even see the intensity into the spots or areas that you're looking at. So integrating all these components, understanding what to look for in those components, and understanding that the goal is for people to feel better. Some of the challenges with this is that when we do a lot of these studies, or at least clients have me review other studies, maybe not the ones we've done, well, if the people don't start out stressed and overstimulated like we all are, I don't know if it's really indicative of something I can apply in real world settings. And this is how Origami, my company, really came to be. I never set out to do this, like I shared. This was a path that I just stumbled upon as it stumbled upon me. We need better help and better translators between hardcore research science done in academia and, let's say, the watered down science that happens in business. We need something in the middle to give us something a little bit more tangible. And that's why today in academic science, we now know color is perceptual. It's a phenomenon that we perceive. It doesn't physically exist. And we know that emotions and emotional connection to color is based on our own perception. Meanwhile, right, we're still pushing on the business and the design watered down science that blue is calming. Or just to give you another example, besides color, that lavender is calming. It is not the case. So we need to kind of flip the way we're asking the research questions from is blue calming to you to what is calming? What color is calming to you? Right? And it's a very simple switch. And unfortunately, academia takes a long time to make that switch. So we're still waiting, and we're grateful they're taking their time, because if not, I would not have work.
Very good. So when you're designing spaces, how much of it is trying to get people to consciously notice something in the space that's helping them versus it's subconscious and it's just having that background effect on them?
Subconscious and conscious are equally as valuable when it comes to design. Subconscious elements support the big picture. Now, ensuring that they're congruent, that's the challenge that most designers have. And I see this constantly. Very simple example. Last night I was at a very fine restaurant, and it was Italian. So, the brain has an expectation for what that food tastes like, also for what sounds and environment and smells I'm looking for. The music, while lovely, it was much more of a club night, lounge music, but with a lot of bass, and it made my food taste less good. And we've proven that, right? We've actually measured that and proven that. But I mean, we laugh about that, but I'm not going to mention the brand, but we help them, who sells one of the biggest denim makers in the world. They were selling in autumn and winter clothes, so kind of more bulky denim jackets and things like that. But the music playing in their stores was, I think, Katy Perry's California Girls Summertime playing. Here, and again, that's subconscious. Did anyone even realize that that was the song that was being played? Consciously, maybe 10% of them. Did it influence their purchase decision? You better believe it did. So when it comes to design, I think it's about creating primary and secondary sensory elements. So we're not overwhelming. Those secondary are reinforcements, right? The other day, beautiful hotel I was staying in the middle of a waterfall, right? I didn't notice until maybe after I left the hotel that my shower had the same pebbles as the river where that waterfall was. Right? As I was showering, I felt this before. Oh my gosh, this is from the river. It's that kind of authentic, intentional design that leads to those beautiful and serendipitous design moments of voila. And in a world of predictive algorithms, you better believe serendipity is a treasure for the human experience today.
I like that, serendipity versus algorithms. That speaks very much to me.
God, I feel like we could speak to you for days, not just an hour. There's so much, and I think we have so many questions, and I'm sort of...
That's what projects are for, by the way.
That's right. And I think maybe that's it, Ari, that maybe at some point we can have a round two of this and dive deeper into some of this subject matter just on its own. But you mentioned the future earlier, and it'd be fascinating to get your take on what the future looks like, how rapidly some of your ideas can be implemented to save humanity, for want of a better word, but, to be that antidote to this overstimulation you talk about.
One of my favorite answers as a scientist now is the one they always gave me. It depends. And I think when I hear it depends, it gives me hope. Because the future that's ahead of us depends on what we choose to design and how we choose to design today. I think most of us right now are probably concerned with AI and that evolution. it's interesting because for me, I'm thinking quantum computing. I'm a few years beyond that, going, wait a minute, guys, forget AI, quantum computing. We got to get a hold of these things. But I think the future, again, depends on what we want it to be. And currently, we're talking on one side about longevity and living beyond 100 years comfortably and happily. On the other side, we're talking about diseases of despair and people now dying from suicide, alcoholism, addiction, loneliness, much more than traditional disease. On top of that, we now have, like I said, AI knocking on our door, reminding us or asking us, what is it to be human? It's a great time to ask ourselves these questions because we're still in control of our world. So I think that the future that I'd like to be part of, and that I think this conversation is about leading fruit to, is a future where technology and nature are symbiotic. Because we are nature and technology is an extension of us. So it's all one thing. It all has to function in symbiosis. And while today we're talking about things like sustainability, I'm really looking forward to the conversations about restoration and regenerative design of the future. And, with my work, for example, with NASA or the other space agencies, I can see so much that's coming in smart materials. And I can't wait for us to be able to live up to, I think, every designer's dream of truly creating a space that can modulate light, that can modulate its shape, that can modulate its texture. And I believe that's where we're headed with the future. Now, we have to be very careful with creating a future that is not escapist, but is one that invites us to be part of it. And I'm not really a big fan of VR or, let's say, some alternative realities we can create. I can see their benefit, but I think that mixed reality will be something that I will support because I think it's our ability to use those technological tools, not just to add more stimulation to a space, but after this conversation, I think we can all agree to maybe sometimes remove some of the stimulation in that place. And not all of us are overstimulated. Most healthy or most seniors today, whether they're living in a senior facility or not, they're missing things like touch, weight, temperature variation, right? Things that we sometimes don't think of as a human sense, but forms part of our sensory system.
Wow. I just love that so much what you were saying. And it's right, because it's really like looking at as well, where are we at? What is our lifestyle looking at? But that decides I think you're right that most people are overstimulated, but there are some that need some of those senses infused a bit more. That's absolutely right. And what I loved as well is what you were saying about the future, because when I think about when the metaverse and stuff, I got really excited about this idea, and I got really excited about these other opportunities to design in that space. And then I constantly had that feeling of, yeah, but I want to connect it back to where we are and what does it mean to us and what does it mean to our communities. When we create an idea in the metaverse, how does it support communities here and a good cause and not just getting lost in that futurism. And I think that's really nice how you were saying that, is to really bridge and gap those two and not just have, because of almost simulation, thinking that world gives us peace and freedom, because it won't for very long. So I think that's a really, really good point.
Honestly, that's why I stopped designing apps for clients, even if it's in the wellness space, or I only did wellness projects, but because I felt like, wait a minute, I can't use the problem to solve it. I have to fall in love with the problem. And with our mobile phones today, right, it's the fact that it's visually dependent, and it overstimulates our capacity to receive information through our visual system. But on top of that, we have this noise epidemic outside, inside, everywhere. We have this unfortunate light contamination that doesn't just happen at night, but happens anytime we're indoors and, creating chaos with our own circadian rhythms. So I think that, again, we are all part of the problem. And now it's really understanding and asking ourselves, who do we want to be in the future? And going back to that question, I see us dealing with a deep question on whether we want to become these ultra computers that can compute all this hundreds of times faster than what our brain can, or do we want to coexist with that in a way that we can still be human? And I think that's a deeper philosophical question, and one that we can have different and a whole debate on. But I really do believe that the future, regardless of how it is, will utilize the senses and leverage the senses for healing. Whether it's through frequency, whether it's through wavelength, whether it's through a combination of these things, I do sense that this is the future of healthcare. And healthcare wellness won't be called that, probably be healing, but that's where we're going with this. With the idea that environments can be designed in one way, but I really don't see architecture and interior being static anymore. Not at all.
It's when I think about the future and what you just said about becoming these kind of like hybrids, almost these robots that we become partly dehumanized. I can imagine this is going to happen pretty quickly with the rate of we see the developments in AI, etc. And then we always hear about how the evolution of the brain just can't keep up with what's happening. So it sounds like what we're talking about here is consciously trying to create these antidotes to all of this stimulation, the evolution of technology that's happening at a rapid rate. When I think about or read about us trying to help ourselves, stay fit, stay healthy, it often is most rewarded when we put effort in ourselves. Do you see technology, like you're talking about, lesson stimulation, doing that for us, and it becomes we're sort of passive in that equation, or are we still actively pursuing that wellness and well-being ourselves?
That's a really interesting question. And the work that we're doing right now with sensory profiling is, I think, step 0 about bringing awareness of what sensory type you are, what are your triggers, and what are your soothers. And that is key. That's what I'm currently writing my book about, empowering you with that awareness. Now, in the future, will that be something that is automated? I think partly so, right? We know that driving, at least today we drive, right? Driving a vehicle, no matter where you're at, is a bit stressful today, especially where I'm at in the Dominican, quite stressful. But will the car recharge me and balance me after I'm done? Maybe, perhaps, yes. Or maybe as I'm there. What I can tell you is that when I speak to people far smarter than I am, in particular in medicine, the origin of everything we know that hurts us starts from some kind of disharmony.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And for me, disharmony is often stepping too far away from our roots and nature. That's kind of often where, for me, disharmony happens.
Well, again, we're an extension of nature, so we're part of that. It makes sense that we have an affinity towards savannas, towards landscapes, towards green, towards water. Now, that said, the further away we get from that and experience it on a fully multisensory way, the less human we become, right? And that's a question I've posed to the space agencies, right? Sensory fitness is going to be very important if we're going to go all the way to Mars because, hey, from the space station, you can see Earth. It's beautiful, and we've heard of the amazing overview effect. But guess what? From Mars, that's just a star. You couldn't tell the difference. So it's going to be interesting as, again, we expand what it means to be human, and at the same time, remind us or ask ourselves, what are the aspects of human that are important to me? And I think we don't ask ourselves that question intimately, personally. We answer it for other people, but we don't ask it for ourselves. And going back to that harmony between the speed of technology and computation and our speed, which is different, but our abilities, which are also much more expansive. We're multisensory in a way that I don't think we're going to be able to develop anytime soon. And I think that it's a biological language we have, just like nature has a language. And I'm really excited to bring that language to the forefront of design so that all of us can design more responsibly.
Incredible. Well, if we could ask you to leave us or the listeners with, something to ponder or consider, what would that be to help the future of design and the subjects that we've been talking about?
Well, because we said that, the senses are a key to regulating our emotional imbalance, which is also a byproduct of our overstimulation. I think the biggest message I can leave you and the audience with is make an effort to become aware of what are the choices that you make and choose to calm you down next time you're out of center. And making that conscious awareness will allow you to identify these design interventions that you yourself have curated ahead of time. And if you can be proactive with that, you're already ahead of the game with not being a victim of your own emotions.
Wow.
Incredible.
Thank you.
Well, like I said, I think there's a day's worth of conversation in the future, but we truly appreciate your time, Ari. And I'm absolutely fascinated by it. So we thank you very much.
I appreciate the hard work and effort you guys are making, because just creating this forum and this conversation is part of that change. And I think there's so many designers out there that are going to places like Global Wellness and other quite credible and established accredited organizations asking these questions. And I think we're going to have to come up with newer and better ways to figure out how to make these exchanges, because this is what we all need. And I think as the design community, it's what we're all seeking. We're trying to solve this problem together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing what you've shared with us. I was just going to ask, you mentioned a book. What do you got coming out and when? Because I'm on the wait list.
I can't give you an exact date yet. It's almost ready to go out to the editor. It's not a large book, but it's really a guide from a design lens, becoming a scientist. And I think that both of you and those listening to us or watching us, if you're in the design world, get ready. You're going to become a scientist as well. It's what's ahead for us. You're going to be a technologist as well. And the more interdisciplinary lenses I think that we equip ourselves with, the better we can handle what's to come, so that we're not designing for design's sake or buying or acquiring technology for technology's sake, but we're really trying to create the human well-being outcomes that we're all needing.
Perfect. We can't wait to read it and apply it to our projects.
And continue this conversation.
Yes.
Because this has really, really been magical. Thank you very much.
Thank you both.